Rejected for his tattoos, he saved the CEO hours later and got the job that changed everything. It started just after 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, the kind of morning that gives people hope. The sun was out. The wind was soft. And for a man like Marcus Reed, that mattered more than usual. He had woken early, pressed his one good shirt, and trimmed his beard with hands steadier than they had been in years. He stood outside the corporate building on 8th and Main, holding a folder that had been opened and closed so many times, the corners had curled like dried petals. Inside were his resumes, clean, carefully formatted, with each word selected like it mattered. He had rehearsed his pitch in front of a cracked mirror and told himself he wouldn't fumble his words this time. He just needed someone to listen. But from the moment he stepped into the marble-floored lobby, the air shifted. People didn't see a man trying to rebuild. They saw the tattoos on his neck. The ones that peeked out from his collar. The ones that told a story no one bothered to ask about. At the front desk, the receptionist didn't greet him with a smile. She glanced at him, then at the security guard, then back at her screen. Marcus introduced himself, said he had a 9:15 with a Mr. Callahan in HR. She tapped on her keyboard, slower than necessary, as if buying time to evaluate whether he belonged there at all. Eventually, she gestured without speaking, pointing to the elevator at the end of the corridor. Marcus nodded, thanked her, and made his way across the polished floor, the sound of his footsteps echoing too loud in a place so silent. When the elevator doors opened, the HR floor felt even colder. Glass walls, white desks, suits everywhere. People barely looked at him, but when they did, it wasn't curious, it was cautious. He waited patiently, then waited longer. Finally, a thin man with rectangular glasses stepped out of an office, looked Marcus up and down, and said flatly, "We're running a bit behind. You can take a seat." Marcus thanked him. Again, he sat in the chair that creaked under his weight and watched as 3 other candidates, clean-shaven, well-dressed, one of them even wearing cufflinks, were called in before him. At 10:12, the man returned and gestured for Marcus to come in. The interview lasted less than 7 minutes. Mr. Callahan didn't ask about Marcus's leadership work at the nonprofit. He didn't mention the glowing letter of recommendation from the community center director. He just looked at Marcus's resume, then at his hands, large, scarred, fingers covered in old ink, and asked if he had ever worked in a professional environment with real expectations. Marcus kept his voice steady. He said yes. He explained his years working security, his time mentoring at-risk youth, his night shifts maintaining city buildings. But the room had already decided. At the end, Mr. Callahan stood up, didn't offer his hand, and said, "We're looking for someone who represents the company's image. Someone a bit more polished." Marcus nodded slowly. "Understood," he said, voice hoarse but steady. He picked up his folder and left without a word. He didn't make it out of the building before a young employee in a gray suit smirked and muttered just loud enough, "Wrong floor, bro." Another added, "Dude looks like he just walked out of a rap video." They laughed. Marcus didn't. He just kept walking. Outside, he paused on the steps. The sun wasn't as warm anymore. He sat on the edge of the planter wall, rubbing his palms together, unsure where to go next. His bus pass was expired. He had walked here from 43rd Street. Maybe he'd walk back too. Maybe he wouldn't. He didn't know. What no one noticed was the man just a few feet away, sitting at the outdoor cafe, older, silver hair, reading glasses perched low on his nose, stirring a black coffee. He had been there when Marcus came in. And now, he watched as Marcus sat on the planter edge, shoulders heavy, dignity intact, but barely. He closed the newspaper he wasn't really reading and folded his hands slowly. He looked at Marcus. Not through him. At him. Just then, chaos erupted behind them. A waitress screamed. Someone shouted for help. The silver-haired man was on the ground, choking violently. His face flushed purple. Hands clawed at his throat. People froze. Others pulled out their phones. Some stepped back in horror. Not Marcus. In 2 strides, he was at the man's side. "He's choking," someone cried. Marcus dropped his folder, got behind the man, and wrapped his arms around him. The Heimlich maneuver was not something he'd been trained to do. It was something he learned the hard way, helping a teenage boy during a volunteer shift at a food shelter. He grunted, pulled once, twice. Then, on the 3rd try, a piece of steak flew from the man's mouth and clattered against the cement. The man gasped, coughed, and fell forward. Marcus held him upright until the man waved him off weakly, signaling he could breathe. A small crowd had gathered. Someone started clapping. Someone else called 911. But the man just looked up at Marcus, eyes wide. He whispered, "You saved my life." Marcus only nodded. "Glad you're okay, sir." He helped him sit properly, then turned back toward the sidewalk, collecting his crumpled folder. As he began to walk away, the man called after him. "Wait. Son, what's your name?" Marcus didn't turn around. "Marcus Reed." He said quietly, "Don't worry about it. Take care of yourself." He was halfway down the street when the man stood shakily and pulled out his phone. "Get me human resources," he said into it, voice sharper than before. Now, that evening, Marcus sat on the steps of his apartment complex. One hand cradled a plastic cup of gas station coffee. The other rested over his folder, now creased beyond repair. He didn't know that across town, the CEO of Callahan and Brandt was reviewing security footage, watching it over and over, watching the man he had just denied a job to save his life, watching how he didn't ask for anything, didn't boast, didn't even linger, just walked away. That CEO wasn't a man easily moved, but tonight, he was quiet. And then he picked up the phone and made a second call. "I want him in my office tomorrow." No excuses. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where true stories crack through the darkness and remind us of the quiet power of humanity. If this moment moved you, if you believe in second chances, in dignity, in looking deeper, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this story. Because somewhere, someone else might need to hear it. Marcus didn't sleep that night. The streetlight outside his window blinked every few seconds, casting uneven shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The radiator clicked and hissed in the corner. He sat at the edge of the mattress, still in the clothes he wore to the interview, folder tucked beside him like something too fragile to put away. He hadn't told anyone about what happened. Not the rejection, not the choking man, not even the brief moment when someone had clapped. What was there to say? He had gotten used to silence after hope. His phone didn't ring. No texts. No emails. Nothing. Just the hum of the city outside and that blinking light that seemed to stutter with the rhythm of his thoughts. The next morning, he pulled on a different shirt, one that had been folded at the bottom of the drawer for too long. The collar didn't sit quite right, but he straightened it anyway. He went to the corner store, bought a plain bagel, and nodded politely to the clerk who never smiled back. As he left, a man in a delivery uniform glanced at his tattoos and subtly stepped to the side as if Marcus were about to bump into him. He wasn't, but he nodded an apology anyway. That was the rhythm of his world. Always the one to step back, say sorry, give space. Always the one expected to carry weight quietly. He applied to 3 more jobs that day. A maintenance position at a warehouse, a security shift at a parking garage, a janitorial role at an office complex that still smelled faintly of bleach and quiet humiliation. At the third one, the woman at the front desk glanced once at the spider web inked on his hand and asked if he had a clean background. He said yes. She asked if he had reliable transportation. He said he walked. She sighed and said they'd call. They didn't dot at a nearby bus stop. Marcus sat down to eat the rest of his bagel. A child pointed at him from across the street, tugging on her mother's sleeve. Her mother whispered something and quickly turned them both the other way. He watched them disappear into the crowd. Not angry, just tired. Later that afternoon, Marcus headed back toward downtown. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the pull of habit, or maybe it was the part of him that hadn't entirely given up. He wandered into a used bookstore, the kind with yellowing covers and handwritten price tags. He liked the quiet there. No one stared. No one judged. Just the smell of paper and stories. As he browsed, an old man behind the counter looked up and said, "You read Baldwin?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, my mother loved him." The man smiled faintly. "Smart woman." He didn't say more. Marcus stayed an hour longer than he planned. When he finally left, the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. A soft drizzle began to fall, the kind that doesn't soak you but still makes your bones feel colder. As he turned onto the block where he lived, he passed a group of boys on bikes. One of them, maybe 17, muttered "deadbeat" under his breath as they passed. Marcus didn't flinch. He just kept walking. Inside his apartment, he lit the stove to boil water for instant noodles. The flicker of the flame reminded him of campfires from his teenage summers, back when he used to volunteer as a junior counselor for inner-city kids. Back when he still believed his life had a straight path. Back before the fight. The conviction. The scar on his record. The ink on his hands that told people more than the words in his mouth ever could. He sat by the window, watching the rain build and run down the glass in narrow rivers. He remembered what his mother used to say, that God didn't forget anyone, that even in silence, someone was listening. He wasn't so sure anymore, but someone had been listening. Someone had watched in a high-rise across town. In an office with windows overlooking the skyline, a man was reviewing notes with his assistant. The CEO, Henry Lansing. He asked again, "You're sure that was his name?" She nodded. Marcus Reed. He was on yesterday's schedule. HR marked him as rejected. Henry sat back. Rejected. He closed the file and stared out the window. Set up a meeting. Tomorrow. I want to talk to him. Personally. Back in his apartment, Marcus stared at a sheet of paper where he had started to write a letter. Not to anyone. Just to himself. To remind himself he was trying. It read, "Dear whoever still believes in me." And nothing followed. He crumpled it up and threw it aside. The next morning, he received a call. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something in his chest tugged his hand toward the screen. "Mr. Reed? This is Melissa. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Lansing's office. He'd like to meet you. Today, if possible." Marcus stood silent. "You sure you got the right read?" he asked. There was a pause. Then, "We're sure." He hung up the phone and stared at the floor. Not smiling. Just still. Like a man afraid to breathe. In case this moment dissolved by noon, he stood once again in front of the building on 8th and Main. Same polished floors. Same cold lighting. But this time, the receptionist didn't ignore him. She stood up. "Mr. Reed? Right this way." As he passed, the security guard gave him a nod. Not a deep one, but a nod. Recognition. Upstairs, the elevator doors opened onto the executive level. Quiet. Expensive, the air perfumed with confidence. Marcus's shoes felt too loud on the floor. He was led into a large office with a view that swallowed half the city. And there sat the man whose life he had saved. No security detail. No lawyers. Just a man in a gray suit and gentle eyes. "Mr. Reed," he said, standing slowly. "Thank you for coming." Marcus tilted his head. "Didn't think I had a choice." Henry smiled faintly. "You always have a choice. Yesterday, you had one. You chose to help me when no one else did." There was a silence between them. Marcus looked around. "So what is this? You offering me a reward?" Henry shook his head. "No, I'm offering you a chance. Because I believe we made a mistake. And I think you deserve better than the way we treated you." Marcus crossed his arms. "What changed?" Henry met his eyes. "I stopped listening to paper. And I started watching people." For the first time in days, Marcus felt something shift. Not trust. Not hope. Not yet. But the beginning of possibility. And in that room, with the skyline stretching out behind him and the city still whispering below, a man who had been told no 1,000 different ways was, for the first time, being asked to stay. He didn't know it yet. But this moment would echo far beyond today. It was the crack in the wall. The one that lets the light back in. Marcus sat stiff in the leather chair across from the CEO, not leaning back, not relaxing. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly as if ready to defend himself against a rejection he had already survived once. Henry Lansing didn't speak right away. He walked over to a cabinet, poured 2 glasses of water, and set one in front of Marcus like it was something sacred. Marcus stared at it for a moment before murmuring a quiet thank you. Henry took his own seat, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, and said calmly, "I know you have every right not to trust this, but I hope you'll hear me out." Marcus nodded once, careful, neutral. He had heard a lot of people talk. What mattered was what came after. Henry leaned forward. "Our company talks a lot about values. Community, character, resilience. But yesterday we failed to live any of those." Marcus didn't answer. Henry continued, "You saved my life. And I don't just mean physically. I mean you reminded me what it looks like when someone acts out of pure integrity. Not because they want something. Just because it's right." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You gonna put that on a t-shirt?" Henry smiled faintly. "No. I'm going to put it into action. If you're open to it, I'd like you to come back. Start in facilities, if that's where you want. Or we can talk about mentorship, community outreach. Whatever path makes sense to you. I just think you belong here. And I want to fix what we broke." Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood up, walked to the window, stared down at the city below. He could see the bus stop where he had sat 2 days ago, eating a bagel and watching people avoid his gaze. He turned back slowly. I didn't save you to get a job. Henry nodded. I know. Marcus walked back toward the chair, but didn't sit. Then yeah, I'll come back. But not because you feel guilty. Because maybe I got more to prove than most. And I'm tired of proving it to the wrong people. Henry stood. Then prove it to us. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll prove something back. That afternoon, Marcus met with the head of community initiatives. Then someone from internal hiring. A few people smiled at him now. Some avoided his eyes, unsure if they should be embarrassed or grateful. He didn't care. He had been looked through for too long to worry now about how people looked at him. By the next morning, the rumors had already spread. The man with the tattoos. The guy who got turned away, then saved the CEO's life. Some people called it a fluke. Some called it karma. One in turn whispered in awe, he's the guy from the video, right? Because yes, the lobby camera had caught it all. A leak. A few seconds. Enough to show what kind of man Marcus was. Enough to make people wonder how many others they had misjudged. Not everyone welcomed him. In the elevator, one junior executive said quietly to a colleague, they're letting anybody in now. Marcus heard it. He didn't respond. Not because he was weak. Because he had heard worse. And because he knew silence can be sharper than anger when held with dignity. But it built. Small comments. Side glances. A cold shoulder from the supervisor on day one. Tasks dumped on him without instruction. At lunch, people moved down the table when he sat. He ate alone more than once. On the third day, someone left a marker on his locker with a message written across it. Wrong place, bro. He wiped it off with his sleeve, then finished his shift anyway. He didn't complain. He didn't shout. But he noticed. He noticed every hallway that went quiet when he passed. Every time his ideas at the morning meeting were ignored until someone else rephrased them in corporate language. He noticed how the HR manager smiled tightly and avoided his eyes. And still he showed up. He showed up on time. Stayed late. Covered when others slacked. Helped the cleaning staff when their cart tipped. He didn't do it to impress anyone. He did it because that's how he was raised. Because a man's word, in his world, had to mean more than his image. At home, things were still tight. Rent was still late. The fridge still hummed mostly empty. But something in him had shifted. Like he was no longer walking toward a closed door, but standing with one slightly open. Just wide enough to see light. One night, as he was leaving the building, a voice stopped him. Mr. Reed. He turned. It was a young woman. Assistant to the CEO. Mr. Lansing asked me to give you this. She handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, you reminded me what leadership looks like. We're watching. Keep going. He folded the note and slipped it into his wallet behind a photo of his sister, who had passed 5 years ago. She used to call him her lion. Said he was always fighting battles he didn't start. The next day, they called a team meeting. Something about launching a new internal initiative focused on equity and representation. Marcus sat in the back. He didn't expect to speak. But then the project lead called his name. We'd like Marcus Reed to join the advisory panel. He'll be working directly with Mr. Lansing's office moving forward. A long silence. Then scattered nods. A few claps. After the meeting, the same junior exec who had mocked him in the elevator pulled him aside. Hey man, he said. Too loud, too fake. No hard feelings, right? It's cool what you did. Real cool. Marcus looked at him a moment. Then smiled, not with mockery, just quiet clarity. No hard feelings. Just clear memory. And he walked away. That evening, he sat on the fire escape of his building, the city buzzing below. He lit a match for an old candle, one that smelled like pine and winter. He wasn't thinking about revenge or pride, just about how long it had taken to feel like a full human in someone else's building. And somewhere in that night, in that soft flickering light, Marcus allowed himself to believe something he hadn't in a long time. That maybe he wasn't just passing through this life. Maybe he belonged. The weeks that followed moved quietly but deliberately, like a current beneath still water. Marcus kept showing up, not just on time, but with purpose. He started learning the names of everyone who worked behind the scenes, the janitors, the cafeteria staff, the delivery drivers whose names no one remembered, but whose lives he always asked about. He remembered birthdays, brought coffee to the guard who stood on his feet for 10 hours a day, held open doors that were usually shut, and people began to notice, not because he announced himself, but because there was no way to ignore the gravity of someone who carried himself with silent dignity. He didn't rise quickly. He didn't get a flashy promotion, but he became something else. The person people looked toward when things were uncertain. The one they asked when they didn't know who to trust. The CEO saw it too. Henry Lansing wasn't the kind of man who made public speeches for show, but he paid attention. On the second Tuesday of the month, he walked into a panel meeting on workplace inclusion and sat in silence while Marcus spoke. Marcus wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just talked about what it meant to walk through the world being judged before being known. He said, "I didn't get my tattoos to scare people. I got them to remember where I've been." He said, "I don't need a second chance. I just needed someone to believe I deserved the first." When he finished, there was no applause, just a stillness that said everything that needed to be said. Afterward, Henry stood and addressed the room. "Some people change a company with strategy," he said, voice steady. "Others change it by simply existing in it with truth." He looked toward Marcus. "Mr. Reed, effective immediately, we'd like you to lead our community equity board. Paid position. Your voice is not just valuable, it's needed." The room didn't erupt. It wouldn't. That wasn't the kind of company this was. But heads nodded. People whispered. And Marcus? He just exhaled. Deep. Quiet. As if something heavy had finally been set down. But not everyone celebrated. The woman from HR, the same one who had dismissed him in his first interview, avoided his eye in meetings now. One morning, Marcus overheard her whispering to a colleague that maybe the company was going too far trying to make a statement. That maybe they were overcorrecting. Marcus didn't confront her. He didn't report her. He just kept working. And that silence, again, cut sharper than 1,000 rebuttals. But there were others, many others, who stepped up beside him. A mailroom clerk who had been with the company 10 years and had never spoken in a meeting now volunteered to co-lead an event. A single mother in accounting who wore a hijab thanked him in the elevator, said she felt seen for the first time in months. A quiet man from IT handed Marcus a folded note that simply read, "Keep going. You're giving the rest of us oxygen." And slowly, the culture began to shift. Not all at once. Not everywhere. But like spring thawing the edges of winter. An intern used to hide the tattoos on his arms. Now he rolled his sleeves up. A woman with a visible birthmark on her face who had once avoided eye contact now held her head higher in meetings. A janitor with a stutter, who rarely spoke, was invited to give feedback on a new operations policy. Marcus wasn't leading a revolution. He was doing something harder. He was making people believe that kindness could exist in the same room as professionalism. That power didn't have to be loud to be real. Then came the company-wide assembly, held in the main auditorium. Henry took the stage, introduced Marcus formally, and spoke of his journey. Not as a miracle, but as a reminder. A reminder that talent does not always arrive in polished shoes or starched collars. That the people who've lived hardest often know how to work hardest. And that character is not a bullet point. It's a way of being when no one's watching. When Henry finished, he gestured to Marcus. The auditorium was full. Hundreds of employees. Some curious, some skeptical, but all watching. Marcus walked to the podium, his steps calm, his face unreadable. He looked out across the crowd and said nothing for several long seconds. Then he spoke. "I was told once that I looked like trouble. That no one would trust a man like me with responsibility. That I'd be a liability to the image of a company like this. But the thing about images is, they fade. What stays is how you make people feel. And what I've learned is that everyone is waiting for someone to see them beyond their cover." He paused. "I'm not here to inspire. I'm here because somebody gave me a seat I didn't have to fight for. And now, I'm here to build more of them." There was a moment of silence. And then, applause. Real. Sustained. Not for a perfect man, but for an honest one. The HR manager who once ignored him was now clapping too, though she looked away when he glanced her direction. The intern who had once mocked his tattoos stood now, eyes wet. In the back row, the janitor smiled and tapped his mop against the floor like a quiet drumbeat of pride. Marcus didn't smile broadly, just nodded, stepped off stage, and kept moving forward. Outside, the wind had shifted. Warmer now, softer. A man who had once been seen as an outsider was now at the center of something real. And while the cameras recorded, the documents were filed, and the policies were rewritten, none of it mattered more than this. That people had changed. Because one man walked in with truth written across his skin and never once tried to hide it. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Reed wasn't being tolerated, he was being trusted. 1 month later, Marcus stood in the doorway of his new office, a modest corner room overlooking the east side of the city. It wasn't large, and it wasn't grand, but the sunlight pooled across the floor in a way that made the space feel like a promise finally kept. On the wall behind him hung a framed photo of his mother, the only personal item he had insisted on bringing the day he moved in. She had passed before any of this, but her voice still lived inside him like a compass. The same voice that once whispered, "Son, you can walk through fire if you remember who you are." Now he sat behind his desk, not as a token, not as a symbol, but as a man in his own right. He led the diversity and equity team with a quiet but firm hand, not preaching, just building bridges between departments, between people, between who they had been and who they could become. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was deep. The security guard downstairs now greeted him not with a nod, but a genuine smile. The mailroom staff started leaving notes of encouragement in his inbox. Employees from departments he'd never worked in would stop by just to talk. They brought their stories, their frustrations, their dreams. And Marcus listened, not to solve, just to understand. That alone began to change things. Slowly, people who had felt invisible started speaking up. Interns no longer walked on eggshells around executives. A janitor was invited to speak at the quarterly planning meeting. Even the HR manager, after weeks of distance, requested a one-on-one. She sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, eyes avoiding his. She said, "I misjudged you. I let bias get in the way of professionalism." Marcus didn't respond right away. Then he said gently, "You saw what you were taught to see. Now you're choosing to see differently. That matters." She nodded, eyes glassy, and left with more humility than she had shown in years. At home, life began to shift too. Marcus was able to fix the refrigerator that had been rattling for months. He bought a real mattress, not the thin one he'd used since his 20s. The kitchen table, long missing a leg, was replaced with one he found at a flea market and restored with care. He didn't buy luxury. He bought stability. Each piece of furniture felt like a reclaimed breath. On Sundays, he started volunteering again, this time at a re-entry program for formerly incarcerated men. He didn't show up as a savior, just as someone who knew what it meant to be doubted. He'd sit in a folding chair, jeans and a hoodie, and say, "I've been where you are. You don't have to stay there." The men listened, not because he was successful, but because he didn't talk like someone who forgot. He still remembered the feeling of being stared through, the sting of being reduced to an inked surface. And in that remembering, he gave others room to hope. Then one afternoon, as Marcus was walking down the street near his building, a young man stopped him. He looked familiar, though Marcus couldn't place him. The kid said, "You don't remember me, do you? I used to be in that youth program. Back when I got caught shoplifting. You were the one who talked to me, told me I could be more than one mistake." Marcus blinked. He remembered now. The scared teen with fire in his eyes. The one who had refused to speak that first day. The young man smiled. "I'm in school now, studying social work. You made me think I could do this." Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. "That's good, man. That's real good." They stood in silence for a moment before the young man added, "People talk about heroes. I think maybe you're just what a man's supposed to be." Later that night, Marcus sat on the stoop of his apartment building, legs stretched out, arms folded loosely across his chest. The city buzzed around him, the hum of traffic, the low murmur of neighbors arguing upstairs, the occasional bark of a dog. All of it familiar, all of it grounding. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But he was whole. And then, almost like a final thread weaving into place, the company released an internal newsletter. On the front page, a photo of Marcus, standing with a group of interns, laughing. The caption read, "From misjudged to mentor, how Marcus Reed helped rewrite our story." He didn't post about it, didn't frame the article. He just folded it once, tucked it behind his mother's photo in the office, and went back to work, because that's who he was now. A man who didn't need loud recognition, just the quiet certainty that he was finally where he belonged. And as the sun dipped low behind the skyline, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk, Marcus stood up, dusted off his jeans, and walked inside. Tomorrow would come. He would face it like he had every other day, with patience, with strength, and with the kind of dignity no job interview could ever measure. It was a late Sunday afternoon when Marcus walked through the small city park just a few blocks from his building. The breeze was warm, brushing gently through the trees as children raced past in bursts of laughter and motion. He wasn't in a rush. He never was these days. He carried a paper bag of groceries in one hand and a folded hoodie over his shoulder, his steps steady, deliberate, his mind quiet. At the far end of the park, an old woman sat feeding pigeons. A young father balanced a toddler on his knees. A jogger nodded in passing. It was a peaceful scene, nothing dramatic, nothing loud. But to Marcus, it felt like something sacred. The kind of peace he had fought for without knowing it. The kind that didn't come from applause or titles, but from standing on solid ground after years of being pushed out of frame. He paused at the bench where he often sat, placed his bag beside him, and took out a bottle of water. Across the walkway, two teenage boys were sitting on their bikes, laughing. One of them had a tattoo peeking out from his sleeve. The other noticed Marcus watching and elbowed his friend. They exchanged a look, uncertain. Marcus gave a small nod. The kind that says, "I see you, no judgment." The boys looked back, nodded in return, then rode off. No words. Just recognition. Just a quiet passing of something deeper than advice. A few minutes later, a young woman walked past with a stroller and slowed as she caught sight of him. She smiled, shyly. She looked familiar, but not immediate. She said, "You probably don't remember me, but I was in the audience that day, when you spoke at the company event. It stayed with me. You said we didn't have to be polished to be worthy. I needed to hear that." Marcus looked up, a soft warmth rising behind his eyes. He nodded once, not to diminish her, but to let her words rest between them. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." She lingered a second more, then continued on, her baby cooing softly as the stroller wheels rolled away. Marcus turned his gaze upward. The sun was dipping low now, bleeding gold across the tops of the buildings. He took out a small notebook from his pocket. No fancy journal, just a spiral-bound pad where he jotted thoughts that helped him breathe. He flipped to a half-used page and wrote in uneven handwriting, "Some days, the world sees you. Other days, it forgets. But if you walk true, someone will always remember." He tucked the notebook back, stood slowly, and continued down the path. At the edge of the park stood a modest community center. The glass doors were smudged with fingerprints, and the lights inside flickered every few minutes. But Marcus had come to love that building. He volunteered there on weekends, talking to teens, helping them with job applications, listening when no one else had time. Today, he didn't go in. He just stood outside, watching through the glass as one of the boys he had mentored led a group discussion. He smiled. The kid had once refused to make eye contact. Now he stood at the whiteboard, writing with conviction. Marcus turned away before the boy could see him. That was enough. Back home, he unlocked his door, set the groceries on the counter, and placed his keys in the ceramic bowl by the sink. On the wall above it hung a framed photo, not of himself, but of a group of people from the center, a snapshot taken during a summer cookout. Everyone was smiling. No suits. No filters. Just real. In the center, one boy had his arm slung around Marcus's shoulders, grinning wide. Marcus wasn't smiling in the photo, but the light in his eyes told the whole story. Later that night, as he settled into bed, he opened a letter he had received days earlier but hadn't yet read. It was from the company. Inside, a simple thank you note from the board of directors. They wrote, "You changed how we see leadership. You reminded us that excellence wears many forms." Marcus read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it behind his mother's photo, like all the others. Not to show anyone, just to remember it happened. In the morning, he rose early as usual, brewed coffee, watered the plant he kept by the window, watched the sunrise crawl slowly across the brick buildings outside. He thought of all the mornings he used to wake up unsure of his place. How each rejection had hardened something in him, but not enough to kill hope. How every moment he had been judged too quickly had slowly shaped the man he had become. And now, in the quiet hush of this morning, he realized something he hadn't dared believe for most of his life. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He just had to keep walking. And somewhere, not too far away, someone else was starting their day. Someone who had been turned away. Someone who felt invisible. Someone who needed to know that second chances weren't fairy tales. They were real. They looked like a man in his 40s with tattoos and quiet eyes, sitting at a desk in a corner office or sweeping the community center floor, or simply listening like no one ever had. In the break room at work, someone had taped a small quote to the fridge. No name, just words. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who will lift us highest. Marcus saw it the next time he went to refill his coffee. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask who wrote it, he just smiled, poured his cup, and got back to work. And as he walked the hallway, shoulders back, stride calm, the people he passed didn't look away anymore. They looked up, because Marcus Reed, once told he didn't belong, had not only found his place. He had made space for others. And in doing so, he had become the quiet echo of a truth we all need to hear. You are more than what they see. Keep going. The light will find you.